Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. As Anna said, I'm Lisa Halverstadt. I'm a reporter at Voice of San Diego who's been digging into city budgets here for about 8 years. So I've got some history, as do our panelists. Before I introduce our panelists, though, I do want to set the scene a bit. Going into this year's budget cycle, things were looking very dire. The city was projecting an $85 million budget gap just for this current fiscal year, and another $154 million gap for the year beginning in July. Obviously a big impact with COVID. Months ago, though, as we were seeing revenues fall, Mayor Gloria made a point that the city has structural budget problems, which basically means the city's set up to spend more money than it's set up to take in. And he said that he needed to tackle those things in the midst of dealing with big revenue drops associated with COVID. Well, then we got federal aid in the form of the American Rescue Plan. And lots of folks were hoping that meant that cuts wouldn't be necessary. Federal funds did help the mayor handle some of those budget deficits in the proposal that he released last week. But the mayor's team said he took his first significant crack at also addressing some of those structural issues with steps including the proposed library cuts that we'll be chatting about more shortly. Now, when it comes to our personal budgets, we all look at finding ways to cut back or make more money when we can't pay our bills. When I checked with the mayor's team on the new money side of the ledger earlier this year, he wasn't ready to talk about tax or fee increases in light of the economic devastation that has been COVID. He also hadn't settled on any cuts at that point. Well, now we have his first budget proposal. And tonight, my goal is to chat with our panelists about what's on the table in this budget proposal and some of the city's biggest budget challenges. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. They are Kyra Greene, Executive Director of the Center on Policy Initiatives, District 6 City Councilman and Budget Committee Chair Cate, who represents communities including Mira Mesa and Sorrento Valley, District 9 City Councilman Elo-Rivera, who represents communities including City Heights and Kensington. And last but not least, Michael Zucchet, who leads the Municipal Employees Association, which is the city's largest labor union. Thank you so much all for joining us tonight. So let's start with the thing that is just getting more questions and attention than really anything else in this budget proposal thus far. One of the biggest surprises in this year's budget cycle was the mayor's proposal to cut library hours. The mayor's budget proposed that libraries only be open Tuesday through Saturday. And Voice of San Diego editor-in-chief learned last week that could mean laying off more than 150 people. Sean, we know libraries are special gathering places. They come with internet access, events, public restrooms. They're beloved in every community, but especially important in some of the areas that you represent. The mayor's team has said that this cut is an effort to address some of the structural budget problems that I was talking about, essentially spending more money than it has coming in, having big future bills. But what do you make of using libraries to address that issue?
Thanks, Lisa. Well, so before I get into the specifics of libraries, what I do want to talk about really quickly is the premise, right? Is the structural budget deficit, and I agree that we have one. But what I think I've been a little bit frustrated by in the conversations I've heard about that structural budget issue is over and over again. And in the immediate, this might be true, but we're only talking about the expense side of things. And the reality is that this city has simply not, the revenue side of the ledger has just not been strong enough for way too long. And so because of that, because we've run a big city on a small town budget for generations, we're left in the situation that we're in. So I just want to level set that part. In terms of the libraries, so libraries just generally very important to me, my team, and our district. And but I also do recognize that there's going to be some hard medicine to swallow while we're doing the work of making sure that this city is funded as it can and should be to provide the services and programs that San Diego residents want. That being said, what was really important to us, even before we knew we were getting, and by us I mean District 9, even before we knew we were getting the federal aid, was that whatever cuts are made are done equitably. So the reality is that no matter, we may have to cut things, right? So as we're diving into the budget and looking line by line, it's very, very possible and probable that certain cuts will need to be made. But we also know that a cut to a library in City Heights or in Southeast San Diego it's just not the same as other parts of the city. There are places where a library is more than just a place where you check out books. It's a place where you access a safe place to be after school as schools reopen, right? It's a place where you are able to use a restroom. It's a place where you can get out of the sun. They are critical aspects of our community. And the last thing I will say is this, is that the blanket approach, and we're going to have to just be a little more nuanced than that. We had some folks call in yesterday and they made some really good points, right? That Monday is the day off for certain folks in certain industries, and that is the only day that they can go to the library, right? Or that Sundays are the day that you go as a family, right? And so my hope is that any cuts that we make, whether it's libraries or otherwise, are done again equitably. And the city council resoundingly approved an amendment we made to our budget, the council's budget proposal or priorities, 9-0, asking that any cuts be made equitably.
Well, Mike, you told Scott that MEA also will push back on plans to lay off library employees. What has MEA said to city leaders about this? Do you expect that this proposal will actually stick through the budget process, both as there are labor talks and also as folks like Sean and Chris weigh in on the budget?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to Voice of San Diego and to your reporting over the years. I have to just do 30 seconds to second what Councilmember Elo-Rivera said about the structural budget deficit. You know, the Center on Policy Initiatives, Kyra's organization, more than 10 years ago, analyzed the San Diego's tax revenues and, you know, everything. Do we have a trash fee, our hotel tax, our sales tax, our stormwater fees? And they found that if San Diego just charged the average of what other California cities charged, we would have an additional $300+ million in revenue in the city every year. And we don't do that. And mayors going back to Pete Wilson have told San Diegans, no, we don't need to raise taxes. We can do more with less. And the fact is we can't. And we've had politicians essentially misleading San Diegans for a long time about that. Councilman Elo-Rivera doesn't mislead. He's very honest about it, and neither does Councilman Cate, who focuses more on the expense side. But basically, we have an imbalance there that either needs to be addressed with significant downsizing of what people expect out of their city government, or they have to help pay for more services. So number one, I want to applaud Mayor Gloria for, sort of talking about the notion of a structural budget deficit and setting up the notion that we have to do these things. Now, moving on to the library cuts, we're not a fan of them. and we're not a fan of them for one of the reasons the councilman said, which is it's the only thing in his budget. It's the only area where he's proposing to lay off any people. And to your point, he's proposing to lay off 153 actual people. And as Scott Lewis noted in his reporting, this is not positions that are vacant. These are human beings who, in the midst of everything else going on, have been working for the city for years through the pandemic, volunteering at the convention center when it was turned into a homeless shelter. And their reward in a, quote, back to work San Diego budget is to get laid off. There's no police officers or lifeguards or management or anybody else in the city budget who's proposed to be laid off. Only 153 librarians. So number one, it's not equitable. Number two, as the councilman said, libraries and rec centers, along with public safety, are the core neighborhood services that every neighborhood counts on. And so it's inconsistent with a budget and a premise of focusing on essential city services to target one of the most essential city services. So look, the mayor, this is his first budget. There's a lot of great stuff in here. And there's, a few rotten eggs, and this is a rotten egg. And we haven't been shy about talking about that. I suspect that Mayor Gloria will be, changing course on this in the coming weeks. I think it was based on some misinformation and misunderstanding from some people around him, including some in the library department who think this is a swell idea, but nobody else does. So yes, Lisa will be fighting this and trying to educate what's wrong with this and why it's inconsistent with what the mayor is otherwise, all the other good stuff that he's otherwise trying to do.
And we'll talk about the revenue raising side of things here. Kyra, there's this growing chorus on the left, obviously suggesting the city needs to be more open to raising taxes and fees to pay for things. And we'll talk about one specific thing that's already sort of making its way through the process. But often mentioned in these conversations are infrastructure needs, tax collection that's free right now for homeowners due to a ballot measure from 1919, People's Ordinance. Google it, people. New state mandates for organic waste processing. I mean, those are just a few of the things. And then obviously, advocates would like to see the city make improvements in a lot of areas like homelessness, climate action, mobility. Now the city is led by Democrats who are at least philosophically more open to tax and fee hikes, but obviously still takes a tough 2/3 vote to pass a tax for a specific purpose, unless perhaps you've got a citizens group that's willing to help out with that initiative. Kyra, how do you think the city should be evaluating revenue increases going forward? What should take priority?
So, Lisa, thank you so much for that question and for inviting me to be part of this panel with so many amazing folks who are they're gentlemen. And I'm going to be the mean person on this panel. I have to say, when I think about what we need to prioritize, one, as we look at these revenue sources, we need to be serious about, I agree with the Councilmember Elo-Rivera, that it is incredibly important that we have a budget that's a revenue that really supports a big city. And then as we look at those revenue sources, we ought to think about them from an equity perspective. The trash ordinance that you mentioned, for instance, is a prime example of providing a tax cut or fee cut to people who are the most advantaged in the system. I mean, I know it's hard to be a homeowner in this region. It's tough, it's expensive. But if you have the ability to do that, to be the people also not having to pay a fee that folks who live in apartments do pay as part of their rents, is an example of a city that hasn't thought about equity in its approaches. I would also say that one of the frustrations I have about the way that the mayor and council members included over the years have framed this as a set of challenges as if they come from nowhere, but they actually come from a perspective. The right wing said they were going to experiment in places like San Diego, and they were going to demonstrate that you could have small government and big privatization, and it would lead to prosperity for everyone. And the reality is that is not what we're experiencing. So I think we have models in our history of this country about raising revenue, investing in government programs that support families, support development, and that's where we have to be focused as we move forward.
I was muted. I do want to talk about one area where that revenue conversation does seem to be moving forward a bit. To provide some context, a few months ago, my colleague Andy Keats summed up San Diego's stormwater woes really well when he wrote that the infrastructure deficit that all of us have been talking about for years is perhaps better described as a stormwater system deficit. Annual funding has really been insufficient. We have floods and sinkholes to prove it. And also there are more mandates now that are just, adding to the projects that need to be taken care of. The city's most recent estimate showed that stormwater projects actually make up more than 40% of the $2.3 billion gap between the money that the city has to do projects and those that it, essentially can't fund at this time of just over the next 5 years. And earlier this year, the City Council's Environment Committee, which Sean leads and Chris also serves on, voted to allow staff to explore a potential ballot measure to increase fees or taxes to try to address this problem. Chris, you were the lone no vote on exploring this ballot measure. Why did you vote no? And how do you think that the city should address these problems with a very large sticker price and currently no way to pay for it?
First off, thanks, Lisa, for having me on and Voice for having me on. And I'm going to come back to that if you don't mind. I'm going to touch on a couple of points that Councilmember Elo-Rivera made, and I do support, and that is libraries. And our office worked very hard a couple of years ago to actually remove implementing library fines for residents because we understand it wasn't working and that wasn't equitable and people were having difficulty having access to our library. So I fully support libraries and work really closely with Library Foundation and our library director over my tenure on council, and agree wholeheartedly that they provide a valuable resource. And for someone, and I've said this at council, that for a neighborhood like Mira Mesa, which has 80,000 residents, we have one library in all of Mira Mesa, and that's important for folks to have access to that library. Quickly on the structural deficit, I also want to remind folks that our current mayor, and I think every one of my colleagues who has stayed on, my 3 other colleagues who stayed on this year, have all supported past budgets. So want to keep that in mind if we're talking about a quote unquote structural budget deficit. Everyone has supported that at some point in time. So I just want to remind folks about that as well too. And get to your point on the stormwater fee, the issue that I have with it is twofold. One is that when you look at what is it going toward, over 80% of the need has to deal with complying with state regulations. And we all know that this has been an unfunded mandate that's been laid at our feet. And in order to comply with that, we believe we're going to need $1 billion to pay for it. When I've asked the question is that if we do this, is there a guarantee that the State Water Quality Control Board will give us the okay on meeting this mandate based on this funding need? And the answer is no. So there's no guarantee that even raising the fee to the $35 per home, which would get us the full amount, would actually get us to what we need. And we're not even going to be asking for that. You know, we're going to go in the field of polling as a city and see what will pass or purportedly pass, and we'll go for that amount. So there will be a gap no matter what between what we need and what we're actually asking for. And the last point of that is that in San Diego, we have some of the highest water rates in the country. It's been noted in our bond ratings at the San Diego County Water Authority as well too, that we have some of the highest water rates of our peers across the country. Right now, over $30 million exists in delinquent accounts because of COVID-19 and the pandemic in our water utility. So we understand there's cost, very much high cost for folks, but in the very next breath, we're going back to voters saying that we want to raise your cost. And I just don't think that's right.
Well, Sean, you actually, obviously have a different opinion on this. You were in the majority on the committee that voted in favor of exploring this possibility. Why do you think this is needed, and what approach do you think the city should be taking?
But I mean, the first part's simple, because we need more money. I mean, very simply, right? And whether it's specifically for infrastructure, and I want to note that the stormwater, while it's a large portion of the deficit, it's not the whole thing. And it's so egregious that it can be framed that way. We have a $230 million deficit for streetlights, and a $280 million deficit for streets and roads. So we are so far from where we need to be. And I don't like the idea of people having to pay more. But one, as Kyra mentioned, we can be fair in how it is done. And I think that we need to be honest with voters and pose the question, right? So we know what they want. We've knocked on doors. We listen to constituents all the time. If they come to us and say, we want our roads fixed, we want our sidewalks fixed, we want to know we're going to have clean water and a good environment, et cetera, then it's our job as leaders to say, okay, we hear you. Here's what the cost of doing those things is, and are you willing to pay? And if they say no afterward, hey, that fine. But I think what's frustrated me is the lack of willingness to ask the question. I think that's an important part of leadership is putting ourselves in situations where we might not like the response we get back. And I would say, the People's Ordinance, in my opinion, it's got to go. Like, that's $35 or $40 million every year that we are subsidizing for, folks who are much better positioned to absorb that cost than those who don't. It's wild. And there's neighborhoods where you can, you walk down the street and you see you see a nice single family home next to an apartment building, and you say which one of those families gets free trash pickup. It's not the one who needs it. So between the People's Ordinance, fixing that, which is actually that does not require 2/3, right? That's a 50% threshold because we'd just be pulling something back. We need to be putting all options on the table to increase revenue because that's what we're going to need in order to get back to your original question, to pay for what we need.
And, certainly the mayor has made a case, and Sean, you just made a case that essentially the city isn't pulling in the money that it needs to address all of the challenges that it has. I'm curious, Mike, Kyra, how would you evaluate the situation? And are there any things that you would advocate in terms of steps to address, whether it's infrastructure or other causes that you think that the city does need to step up before voters or come up with some sort of proposal or otherwise to try to address?
Yeah, well, I mean, to Councilmember Elo-Rivera's point, I mean, by any actual measure or metric, whether it's fire stations per square mile or park and recreation workers per acre of parkland, or police officers per 1,000 residents, or any other metric as to how sort of robust our city government is, San Diego is doing more with less than any other jurisdiction in the state of California. And so it's really just a fundamental choice that our citizens and elected officials want to ask is, what level of service do you want? And it goes back to the notion that for 40 years, San Diegans have essentially been promised that we can do more with less. And that's just a fallacy that keeps unraveling. And it's resulted in a city whose operations are not doing so well. The mayor said in his State of the City address, what's the state of the city? So is essentially what he said. And that's very accurate. And let me just talk my own book just for a second. I mean, employee compensation in the city of San Diego is 25% below the median of other jurisdictions with which we compete with for employees. We're also the only jurisdiction for the last 10 years or so that doesn't offer a defined benefit pension. So anybody pursuing a career in public service, the city of San Diego is the last place they want to go. That has resulted in a vacancy rate, which for MEA represented positions is over 15% vacancy when the city assumes, that's more than twice what the city assumes for vacancy. Just to point out one thing, Councilman Elo-Rivera talked about streetlight installations. Because we don't have the employees, we end up contracting out a lot of services. And this is not the good kind of contracting out that Councilman Cate might argue for, where you save money. This is the type of contracting out that's more expensive than using in-house employees, but we can't do it because we don't have the employees. So that's a lot of infrastructure projects. It includes streetlight installation. We don't have enough people to install streetlights, so we pay a private company more money to install streetlights rather than investing in our human capital, which then helps support our essential city services. So look, I have a pretty dim view of the city's operational situation right now. Every single department, you can tell a story or an anecdote about how things are being held together with threads and MacGyver fixes and patchwork, and because that's the way it's been going for a long time. So actually addressing either the structural revenue shortfall or the overspending that doesn't match our revenue does have to be addressed. It has to come to a head here one way or the other.
So what I would say about this is, there's so many exciting portions of this that I want to get into, so I'm going to try to keep it tight here. So the first thing is, this city, the way it's been budgeted, has created perverse incentives not to raise taxes. And what I mean by that is, when we put tax measures in front of the public in San Diego, it is disproportionately low-income neighborhoods of people of color who support those measures. And it is actually often our wealthier neighborhoods and our whiter neighborhoods where we see a lack of support for tax increases. And one of the reasons that that's true is because so often in this budget, because we have not budgeted in an equitable way, The people with the most resources don't see a city in trouble. Their streets are paved. They aren't experiencing so many of these challenges. So it looks like we have enough revenue from their perspective, and they're able to support an anti-tax perspective because they don't suffer from that lack of tax money, revenue coming in. And it's the places that would support it that we then don't budget to provide the resources, even though they're willing to pay. And it's not that they're making less of a sacrifice. I disagree with Mr. Zucchet, and I don't like to do that very often because he's very smart. But it's not every department that's suffering. At the same time that we can't provide decent office space to public employees, that we argue that we can't afford pensions, we have a police budget that's been growing over the same period of time. And so what it brings me to, and I think about all of those pieces, is that we have balanced this budget over and over again to the extent that we've balanced it on the backs of poor people, on the backs of working people. And we've given them things that they don't want. We've given them more policing and less of the things that actually create safety, like public libraries. We've told them that technology can somehow solve the problems that are about human connection. So for instance, the mayor's proposal involves taking out librarians, but giving people machines to let them in, technology to let them into the library. It's just a total miss on the ideas of what equity and justice look like. And the thing that's the harsh thing to say is that people who keep passing budgets like this, they have to own that this is about supporting a racist and classist system that is embedded inside of the way that we budget. I'm not saying that's the intention of the individual people, but if that's the outcome of the budgets that we pass, then we have to own that. And so to me, it's like, let's take a look. To this point about revenue, as Mr. Zucchet pointed out, CPI did a study over a decade ago demonstrating that if we just raise taxes in our region to the average of our state, we would be able to close a significant portion of this budget gap. But it's been politics that stopped us from raising that. The final thing I'll say is I am most frustrated during this period about how we keep saying that we have an economic crisis created by COVID. We should be clear. Poor people, working class people, they have been hit by a COVID crisis, but there are people, and many of them live at least part of their lives in San Diego, who have made record profits during this. If you've invested or you're a stakeholder in Amazon, if you're making money through the technologies that have connected us, that money has gone into the pockets of the wealthy. And it's not just a San Diego problem, it's a statewide problem to figure out how to bring that revenue into the state that can come to cities. But I will tell you, it's the politics of San Diego. It is a politics that is to the right on taxes that often holds the state back when we put forward revenue measures that could help fill that gap. So I think there are really clear solutions, but they're about people telling the truth about needing revenue and about needing revenue to achieve racial and economic justice.
Wow. Well, Mike and Kyra, you've both brought up some things I want to follow up on in just a moment, especially with regard to the police budget and employee pay. But I do want to touch base with Councilman Cate here, who I know has a bit of a different view on revenue increases. You did touch on that earlier, but I want to give you the chance to sort of rebut what some of the others here have said about revenue measures, since I know you have such a different viewpoint.
Okay. I think I'm gonna get beat up for a little bit, but it's okay. I will say this. I mean, from a statewide perspective, right? I mean, it hasn't been my party who's been in control of the state legislature in many, 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 many decades, and there have been numerous attempts to place measures on the ballot from a statewide perspective that would obviously bipartisan manner have struck down those proposals. And it's just not my party is the sole purpose of the sole individuals responsible for bringing down ballot measures. And we have a new council. We have a mayor and new council. They're all free to place as many revenue tax increase measures on the ballot in 2022 as they like. And I have a feeling there'll be probably a few of them. And the voters will ultimately get to decide what they want to do. And that let it be. And I can guarantee you, my party is in the majority when it comes to the city of San Diego. So blame when those measures fail cannot be squarely placed on the feet of Republicans to get that done. So I good luck. We'll see what happens when those measures come to the ballot. But to the point where the Mike brought up of overspending, again, we've added a number of different programs and departments over the last 10 years. And You know, I have not asked for any new programs to be added for this year's budget or last year's budget, probably the year before that as well too, understanding that, you know, we're in a position, I think, as a city that we are overspending, you know, and to Mr. Zucchet's point, I've told him and I've talked to his members and others many times, I'm all for giving salary increases to employees. I agree. We need to pay our employees more, 100%. And I have supported every salary increase that has come before me because I believe in that fact that we need to pay our employees more. But we need to choose where that money comes from, you know, and I get castigated because I have the temerity to say that I don't think we as a city should be spending arts and culture. You know, I don't. I think there are many other programs that I think we can do without, that we should be going back and redirecting those dollars back into our employees. And so another point is we as a city have not had any privatization whatsoever. Managed competition, it failed, it didn't happen, we didn't move forward on it. So there is no privatization happening when it comes to actual departments. Contracting out, is what Mr. Zucchet pointed out, does happen, and we can have a conversation about what is actually more expensive to do than otherwise. And I agree that some of those contracts are more expensive than having employees do it, and I'd rather have employees do it. But you know, we have never had a serious conversation about what the city should be in the business of providing when it comes to services.
Well, and I would love to have a follow-up panel about where the city is overspending, so we can dig into that more. I do want to hit on a really major budget debate to watch this year. So last year, literally hundreds of residents and activists urged the city council to defund the police. That didn't happen. There was actually a $27 million increase in the police budget that was approved by the city council. And now this year, new Mayor Todd Gloria is proposing a $19 million increase to the police budget and maintaining police staffing, but he's also pitching a $4 million cut to the department's overtime budget. He has hinted at other changes like getting the police less involved and responding to mental health calls, for example. Activists, though, have told my colleague Andy Keats they really aren't thrilled with what they're seeing so far. There was a bit of an interesting conversation, as there often is, on Twitter. Last night, Nick Serrano, Mayor Gloria's deputy chief of staff, made a comment essentially saying that the $19 million increase in the police budget was a result of a pension obligation that the city has to fulfill, not a service level increase. Now, it is true, we can all talk about how the pension bill is up. Hopefully we will talk about that here shortly. But obviously the mayor does have some choices here. He could propose cutting positions, or he could try to negotiate pay or benefit changes with the police union. He's decided apparently for now he doesn't want to. Kyra, you've been involved in local police reform discussions and have had some thoughts about police overtime for sure. But what did you make of the mayor's budget proposal?
So this gives me an excellent opportunity to also address something Councilmember Cate said, which is I am fortunate to work at the Center on Policy Initiatives, and we're nonpartisan. So we don't care what party people belong to. We care about whether they deliver on behalf of working people. And that's always where the critique comes from. And I will say that's a critique for this mayor. Quite frankly, in the moment that we're in, I was deeply disappointed to see the approach he took around this. There are opportunities. It's not possible to say, well, these are just personnel cuts, or these are just personnel increases, when you're cutting 150 positions in the library. There are decisions that could be made about personnel. And then the other challenge for people who are advocates for police changing what we define as public safety is that we get pegged as being anti-police. That is utterly ridiculous to me. There are good people doing all kinds of work in the city. What I am critiquing is the structure, the solution of policing to problems, the proportion of the solution to the problem. So we should not be sending people out with a gun to deal with a problem. We shouldn't build a whole system of people with guns to go address when someone steals something worth $20 or gives a fake $20 bill. We shouldn't be sending people with guns to address graffiti. It makes no sense. It is not the right approach. It doesn't matter who that person is, how much you train them. The idea that you've trained a person for dealing with violent situations and you're sending them out to deal with problems of, poor behavior, desperation, or sometimes criminalization of things that are just about surviving, being unhoused. So for us, there has to be a really serious conversation about whether the institution of policing is right, not about just the people who are doing it. I believe many of those people could be redirected to do other types of work, but they would do that work not as police officers, not as armed people addressing communities. And so I think that is the thing that the mayor has really avoided, quite frankly, in many of these conversations, this underlying conversation about what is the appropriate response to creating a sense of community. And I think the combination of police budget increases at the same time that we're saying we're overspending, the first thing that most of us would do if we thought we were overspending, and I think I've been clear, I don't think that's all the story here. But if there's a conversation about overspending, to your point, Lisa, when I look at my personal budget, I look at, well, where have I been increasing my spending? And those are the places that I would be looking to make decreases, not in the places I've already cut all the way to the bone that are not meeting the needs of communities. I know this is a little afield, but I do want to say one other thing to this point around equity and infrastructure. Even when we look at the infrastructure deficit, we only count the parts of the deficit of the things that we actually measured. For years, for instance, we didn't do a survey of our parks. So we didn't understand that there were communities with significant park deficit or that needed increases in improvements in those park facilities. So we can think about all the other things we're not doing. We didn't put in all the streets and roads in communities until we did a survey of all those streets and roads. We didn't know how many, some people didn't know how many communities didn't even have paved streets in them as portions of the community. So again, everywhere I'm looking at this issue with the mayor and his proposed budget, there is still a question. There's the Band-Aid solutions and lip service to equity, but not the deep look at whether the institutions themselves are broken and incapable of delivering justice and equity. And I think that is the conversation around policing.
Sean, you said last year, obviously before you were elected, that this year's budget would offer a chance for the city council to demonstrate its willingness to make changes when it comes to policing and listen to Black San Diegans' concerns. The city council now has some information, including an IBA's report that's detailing the police budget that it did not have last year. How are you expecting this year's budget conversations to play out, and what do you think is the likelihood of significant change?
Well, in terms of how I'm expecting it to play out, I do trust that our council will have a thoughtful conversation. And I think the other part that's going to be critical here is the community is engaged in a broader way much earlier, right? Kyra has been doing this work around Kyra and CPI have been doing this work around the budget, along with a lot of my friends from the advocacy and organizing world for years. But last year, there were hundreds of people who were awakened by a brutal murder, and because of that, they were engaged in the budget process and specifically around the issue of what's spent on policing in a way that they hadn't been. And I'm quite confident that many of those folks are still awake and are paying close attention and will be engaged in a way that they hadn't been. So that I think that'll be a very important change to the conversation. I also, as I said yesterday, this isn't getting fixed this year. The whole thing isn't, right? So we can do better, but it's not, this is generations in the making, right? There are contracts that have already been signed. There are agreements that have already been made that are going to take a long, and what we're talking about, what I think Kyra and I have a shared vision of is public safety that actually makes everyone safe, right? In every neighborhood, and that is built dependent upon the vision and needs and trauma of each neighborhood. And that's going to take some time to do. That is hard work, that it's going to require difficult conversations, but it's going to take some time. So I think that part's important. Right now, as an example, so many people just default to thinking that police are the only way to solve an issue. The college area is a good example of this. So the area immediately surrounding San Diego State, there are huge issues around noise complaints and some real issues that are impacting the quality of life of neighbors there. And because all they know is a police unit to be assigned to that problem, that is what they want. That is far from the only thing that can fix that situation, right? And so we're having conversations with SDSU about about a restorative justice program that they are talking about. And there's things that we can do as a city to address that. It certainly does not need to be, officers with a gun. And my guess is they probably didn't sign up to do their jobs to deal with noise complaints either. And so this, like I said, this is going to take a lot of time. And I hope that this year we can take a real big and important step forward in being more nuanced and thoughtful about how we are allocating our resources with respect to policing in pursuit of a more safe San Diego.
Well, I think we could certainly, as if with many of the topics in this discussion, we could have a whole panel just about some of the topics we were just talking about. But I want to make sure that we hit on some other things. And one really big one is, as Mike brought up earlier, is employee pay issues. Municipal Employees Association has been sounding the alarm for years about an employee pay crisis, talking about how employees elsewhere in other cities in San Diego County and elsewhere in the state are being paid more. A city audit last year spotlighted further issues in that realm when it comes to recruiting and retention. And Mike and other city union leaders are now in the middle of labor talks, trying to push for change. The mayor's budget proposal includes $22 million for pay increases. Mike, what do you think of that initial offer? How are things going with the negotiations?
I'm sorry, you just asked a union goon if there's enough money on the table? No, there's not nearly enough money on the table, but we do very much appreciate the mayor. I noted in the mayor's, slides, PowerPoint presentation to the council, that was one of the highlighted, new expenditures was a focus on beginning to address the gap, which is causing the recruitment and retention crisis, which is causing the vacancies, which is causing services to suffer. So, so we appreciate his efforts in that. I hope we're going to wrap up here with a contract that that's going to really do that here in the next couple of days. So we'll have to see. There's a lot I would love to say, but that's all I can say at the moment. And
well, please say it. Please say it, Mike.
Well, let me step in a little bit and go back to the previous issue, if I might, just for 60 seconds. I mean, I do want to say that the mayor's office statement about that increase in the police budget is accurate. I mean, 20 years ago when the city got a pension bill, they might think, should we pay this or not? But these days, and for the last 16 or 18 years, when you get a pension bill, you pay it. And the SDSERS, the retirement system of the city of San Diego, and their actuary changed assumptions last year, which increased pension costs, including and especially to the police department. And that's what that increase is. So I do just in the matter of fairness, it's true that the mayor didn't cut the police budget, but I think it's also unfair to tag him as saying that he increased it. And I would say one thing else about the police budget. There's a lot in the police budget. There are 911 dispatchers in the police budget. I don't think any San Diegan who is calling 911 in the worst moment of their life, whether it be a police emergency or medical emergency or vehicle accident or anything else, wants cuts to 911 dispatchers or any of the other support staff. But in the past, when we have just sort of cut the police budget just for the sake of cutting the police budget, it tends not to be sworn police officers or a rethinking of public safety that happens. They tend to just lay off support staff. So to Sean's last point, in the Great Recession 10 years ago, they laid off all of the police investigative aides. Those are civilians who assisted detectives, much cheaper, half the cost, half the salary. They laid off police service officers who responded to a lot of non-emergency calls that sworn officers, as Sean said, probably didn't want to respond to, and you could do it much more cheaply. And now instead, more expensive sworn officers are doing that work. And so I do think this takes, this broader vision and this rethinking is more than just cutting the police budget, because you don't want to be cutting things that nobody is suggesting to cut. And I'm not saying Chief Nislight would do this, but many chiefs before him, when given a command to cut the budget, do that. So, the mayor's been in office a few months here, and I think we all support change. And I'm personally not surprised it's not happening right away. And Frank, I think it's a good thing because it needs to be thought through carefully, because obviously public safety is one of the core, if not the core missions of the city of San Diego.
Well, we wouldn't have a budget event without talking about pensions. So let's do that. So just for some additional context to what Mike was describing, the city's pension bill hit about $415 million for this year that is starting in July, to give you a sense of just how big of a bill we're talking about. And there was an increase, there were assumption changes, but also, people are living longer and they're getting paid more, just, as a natural progression of things. City voters did back pension reform via Proposition B back in 2012, which meant that new city employees other than police officers weren't going to be getting pensions anymore. And the promise at the time was that the pension bills would get smaller and they would have less of an impact on the city budget. But a judge ordered that reform needed to be pulled back, which then raised the prospect of the city having to pay to get employees who'd gotten 401ks into the pension system instead. Now it is sounding like that won't maybe be as costly as we thought, and we'll have Mike talk about that in a minute. But first, let's just talk about the big issue here. Chris, you were a big supporter of Proposition B, and obviously the city's big pension bills are still hurting the city budget. Obviously this policy that was pushed to try to lessen the size of these bills over time is now off the table, it seems. So what do you think the city should be doing to address this issue now? Still have big pension bills every year.
They're going to get bigger. I don't think there's any other way around that, whether you think that's appropriate or not. I mean, we can have that debate, whether we see a child of Prop B come forward, could happen, and understanding kind of what the mistakes of the past were, and how to account for that and do it where it could hold up in court. I mean, I think that's on the table, but all this is to be negotiated. I think Mr. Zucchet will probably say that is, what happens now, what happens to employees, what's the benefits and offer, how do you make whole, all that stuff it's to be negotiated. There will be a cost to pay. The scope of that cost is what we need to understand, and I'm sure over the next weeks and months we'll get a clearer picture of what that will look like now that the time period for filing the appeal has lapsed.
Mike, you and MEA have really been at the table and big actors in this whole Prop B challenge. What's your understanding of the current outlook on the post-Prop B cost?
In terms of unraveling Prop B?
Yes.
So, we begin that discussion with the city soon. Obviously, the actuaries will be involved, but there's a fundamental premise of the court order to have the city own up to its illegal placement of Prop B on the ballot, which it now has to unwind, which is that the city has to make employees whole and put them back in the position they would have been had Prop B not happened. That's the bad news for the city. The good news for the city is that they get credit for what they did do in the meantime, which is contributed to a 401k style benefit that has been invested by most employees in the stock market since 2012. What has the stock market done since 2012? Well, it's gone straight up. And so, it's gone up, 12% in the last 4 months. So there's a lot of money that the city essentially gets credit for to sort of put everybody back in the pension. So the answer is unknown, but it won't be surprising to anybody who's sort of looking at the numbers if the cost of unraveling all this is actually not that expensive. And one of the reasons for that also is the fact that in 2009, general employees agreed to a new pension system that was less expensive for the city, less generous in terms of benefits, effectively a longer retirement age. And it's one of the reasons we were so fundamentally pissed off by the city's leaders at the time turning around literally while that agreement the ink hadn't even dried on it, and running to the voters and throwing red meat of pension reform, which has been a massive disaster for the city, has contributed to the operational problems of the last 10 years. The city can't hire people from other jurisdictions because they have time and pension systems. So why would they come to a jurisdiction with no pension system? And Carl DeMaio and others back in 2011 and 2012 said, no problem. We're going to lead the way. San Diego is going to be the leader and everybody's going to follow. Nobody followed. Not one jurisdiction in the state of California followed. So San Diego remains today, and this will be over soon, the only jurisdiction without a defined benefit pension for employees. That's the definition of a competitive disadvantage. That and a 25% discount on your salary. And do you want to work for the city of San Diego? No thanks. So I just want to talk about throwing red meat of asking me about Prop B. It's been a complete and utter disaster. So those who want to try it again with Prop B, no problem. Let's just dig the hole deeper. And I think if anybody does want to go to the voters and really explain how Prop B worked out just dandy, and if the courts hadn't just stricken it down, maybe, we'd be in much better shape now. That's absurd. What we need to do is move forward, get everybody back into the pool, build our city up again, build our city employees back up again, because they are the city. They're the ones who provide the services that we all count on, and move forward and not look backward.
Lisa, if I could also just jump in here, I feel like it doesn't matter which side of this argument around pensions I hear, whether it's people who are, representing folks who get a pension or people who are opposed to pension systems. The thing that I feel like we don't do enough, we talk in all this jargon, we talk about actuaries and let's be clear about what's at stake with a pension. People are going to either retire and they're going to have money to survive in this area, or they're going to be poor. That's literally, we're talking about retirement security. We're talking about the fact that our city employees are also not in Social Security. I mean, if you were someone looking at the world and you had no guarantee about what your income would look like when you are elderly, the position at CPI is far too many people already face that. I have zero interest in the public government being part of creating more of that problem. And you will pay. We all will pay for people's retirement security one way or the other. We can do it with dignity by ensuring people that the right to that security, a system that does that while they work, or we can wait until people are living in their cars or struggling on the streets, and then we can talk about another complicated, costly problem that we don't know how to solve. So I feel like it's important to talk about pensions in the context of something that Americans are deeply proud of, and that is the creation of a deeper system, Social Security and other systems that have ensured that fewer people live their later years in poverty. And while I know think about it, how perverse it is. That's only in this pension conversation that we are sad that people are living longer. We are sad that people have the opportunity to enjoy a life that's not just labor. This is actually a beautiful thing that we want to provide for people. And it reminds me of the other conversation we had. It's similar around the stormwater conversation. We talk about these things as problems. We're not talking about the fact that what Councilmember Cate called the unfunded mandate comes from people who are responsible. Let's be clear, the State Water Quality Control Board. We're talking about the quality of the water that we have in our region, a life-sustaining force. So I think in all of these conversations, one of the priorities for CPI and for all the partners we work with is to remember that we're talking about people's lives and safety and well-being, and that is what is at stake here. And I think when we come back to that, we have a completely different conversation when we ask people, do you want to take away retirement security from other folks for when they're older? That's the way we need to make sure we're having these types of conversations.
If I may real quick, because I want to make sure, I don't want to leave the impression to folks that since Prop B was instituted, that we are just casting our city employees into a life of food insecurity and housing insecurity or whatever else. That's not the case at all. Mr. Zucchet just stated that there are going to be employees who actually earn more since Prop B in their retirement accounts than otherwise they had been in the defined benefit pension system. So I want to make sure we're not going to state that our employees are going to be stuck with a future in which they are going to not be able to provide for their families or themselves. That's not the case at all. And in fact, there might be employees who don't want to go back into the defined benefit pension system because of the fact that there is a potential for greater earnings in the current system that they're in today.
I would just respectfully disagree and say I'd want to go ask people who were reaching retirement age during the Great Recession when their retirement accounts bottomed out, whether they felt like they were cast out. There were people who had to work longer and with less security, who've been unable to enjoy the lives that they wanted to because when they reach retirement age, I'm not disagreeing. You can look at chunks of time where people are making more money, but the question is whether you're asking people to gamble with their later years. And there is a risk there. I mean, Councilman, we have to tell the truth about that part, that there are risks and there are people who have suffered in the past from those types of risks in the market.
Absolutely, and there were risks, and we're actually paying for it now. There's a reason why our pension bill is $415 million right now. It's because of the risks of what happened in the stock market and what we're required to do, and also the risk of the decision of elected officials under MP1 and MP2 who decided to play these shenanigans with the taxpayer dollars, and as Mr. Zucchet said, 16 years ago, decide, no, I don't want to pay our pension bill. We'll do something else, and that's $415 million that is otherwise not going to other services. When the normal cost, I mean, the pensions is that's not the issue. It's the unfunded liability that's killing us right now when it comes to the cost of our pension bill.
Well,
Lisa,
and
could I just say one thing? So sorry.
yes, one thing, and then I want to make some time for some questions from folks that are joining us and hit on one more topic.
I'm so sorry. So Councilman Cate, fair enough on the timing of the stock market and these 401ks right now. I would just point out that going back to the library employees, these 153 library employees, a good chunk of them, something around 50 of them, make minimum wage. They make $14 an hour working for the city of San Diego with no benefits. So yes, there are a lot of city employees that are unable to live in San Diego. I don't know anybody who can live. I respect anybody who can live in San Diego on minimum wage, and I know people do it. And a lot of them are city employees. So I just want to throw that out there.
Well, I want to hit on one more topic before we throw some questions at you from folks who've been watching. Obviously, even during a pandemic that has put so many other issues on the forefront, polling and feedback, whether it's in the form of questions that I get or, certainly comments sent to council members' offices, homelessness is a major concern for San Diegans. And now we have a pandemic that has put even more people on the brink. It's also a very, very costly problem. The city's 2019 homelessness plan suggested it would cost $1.9 billion to deliver the thousands of new homes and other sorts of housing aid that were believed necessary to seriously address this problem. The mayor did propose in his budget proposal putting an extra $10 million toward homelessness solutions and formalizing the creation of a new city department to address the issue. Sean, you recently wrote an op-ed for us suggesting that San Diego could use this crisis as a moonshot moment. I'm curious what solutions you think the city should pursue and how it should fund them.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I think that op-ed was came from a place of urgency because the window's closing for federal relief and assistance to address the homelessness crisis. And I think, as I shared with some friends, there's a sense of shame that I have. When I walk to this office and walking past people who are sleeping on the street, and now I'm responsible for that. There's a moral obligation we have to own that and to deal with it. And so it's just there's an urgency that while the federal government and the state government is willing to help with this, we need to just seize the moment, because the cost, both economically and morally will not go away. It will only grow. So that's why there's been that urgency. I bugged Councilmember Cate, about a month ago to see if he would sign on, and he did in a letter to make sure we maximize the federal dollars by way of a FEMA reimbursement program. I think that's getting more complicated with each day that passes, based on some of the requirements of that reimbursement program. So that is what I'm hoping to do is just make sure that we're maximizing the potential there, and recognizing that for every day that we allow the problem to grow, it will cost more down the road. And what does that say about us, just from a moral standpoint, for a city of this size, of a city with this much wealth, to allow that crisis to grow? The last thing I will say is I think that the mayor is doing important things on this front, and having a department dedicated to addressing homelessness is important, because it's going to make sure that we allow fewer dollars to slip by, that our services are better coordinated, and that is super, super important. And it's an example of investing on the front end in order to bring more on the back end.
Kyra, I've heard you say that crises should be used as opportunities. What do you think the city should be looking at to address income and other disparities that only fuel our homelessness crisis? And how do you think that should be playing out in our budget?
So I want to start by saying I appreciate the challenge that elected officials face in tackling this. And I don't think that any level of government has to do it on its own. I think it's unfair to ask cities to just address this issue on their own. I think there are two things that cause people, if you think at the broadest level, the two major things that cause people to be unhoused is either lack of access to healthcare, right? Whether that's mental health or physical healthcare to deal with trauma. And the other is lack of money to pay for housing. So there are things like addressing the access to healthcare that are probably not things that cities can do by themselves. There has to be strong partnership with county government, state and federal sources to really address closing that gap for healthcare and mental health care. But I do think that local government should use every tool at its disposal to make sure that jobs in the public and the private sector pay people enough so that they can reasonably afford housing. That's critical. And part of that is that we have to treat housing in this crisis. What should be abundantly clear is that housing is a basic human necessity. And when we looked at other basic human necessities, we said we would not allow people to price gouge those basic human necessities, but allowing corporate landlords to buy up real estate and then charge exorbitant rents for people to live here, to allow people to get reductions on the cost of land so that they can build luxury housing that doesn't meet the housing needs of the people who live here. That is no different. Price gouging in that space is no different than the people who bought up all the hand sanitizer at the beginning of COVID and then sold it for exorbitant prices on the internet. So that's why, even though it's not, popular with the people who are often having these conversations, it is popular in the community to talk about things like rent control and to talk about things like public subsidies for affordably priced housing in transit-oriented locations. It's why we're even thinking that we have to think much more broadly, like not just the Band-Aids. We have to support land trusts and other innovative approaches to keeping land and housing in public hands and not as a profit center for folks, because you should not be able to profit off of the suffering that people experience when they can't access basic human necessities. So like to us, that's really, and there are government programs, there's philanthropy, there are impact investors who are interested in experimenting with these other models because they understand the importance of really addressing this crisis. But if we think we can keep the market how it is, we think we can say that government shouldn't have any role in controlling the prices of housing, nor should it have a big role in setting wages in our region, then we're going to keep saying we're not quite sure how to solve this problem. Let's do another study. Let's take another look at it. But what we know from those studies is that providing housing is the solution. Making sure that people can afford housing is the solution. And we can't keep saying no to all the ways that we could accomplish that because it offends our political sensibilities or some old archaic notion about how the system ought to work. We have to address how it does work.
And I think in terms of some of the revenue conversations that we were speaking of earlier, I think we'll probably hear again about a housing bond proposal or other funding proposal. And that's certainly something, I would love to discuss with all of you in a future event. But I do want to make some time for questions from our readers and viewers here. One good question, I think I'll open this up to everyone. Should San Diego be refocusing for other sources of revenues as opposed to relying on tourism? Some context for this is that during the pandemic, our tourism economy has been decimated and devastated. And San Diego, the third largest source of revenue in City of San Diego's budget is its transient occupancy taxes, hotel taxes. And so the lack of this money coming in has really forced a lot of the tough conversations that I was describing earlier and made us really want for more federal aid. Who wants to take this one?
Well, first of all, I support raising any tax anytime. So I don't discriminate on that front. The premise though, I just want to make clear, property tax and sales tax account for are by far and away the biggest revenue sources to the city's general fund. They account for almost $1 billion of the city's 1.7 odd $1 billion general fund budget. So I'm not sure it's fair to say what a significant part of the hotel tax the budget is, but yeah, I mean, I think I know this probably won't be a popular thing to say with a lot of people, because I know there's a lot of sort of convention center haters out there, but the convention, the group tourism and conventions that have gone to zero in the last year are what is really killing the city's hotel tax. Leisure travel has actually come back fairly nicely, but those conventions generated a tremendous amount of not only hotel tax, but sales tax in the spending that went on in the region because of conventions. And so I just wanted to throw that out there as a little point that's one thing that's been really exposed. And in my other role as a port member, talk about a jurisdiction that's heavily reliant on the tourism economy and cruise and conventions and hotels and restaurants. Obviously, we have a robust maritime business and other things, but it has been devastating. So the point of the question is good. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, but I guess my suggestion is I don't think too many of San Diego's eggs are in the tourism basket. I actually think it is fairly well diversified.
Would anyone else like to take this?
I was just going to joke, but might beat me to the punch a little bit is we can just become a landlord like the port and absorb all their land and just make immense amount of money on rents, but that's just, and parking as well too.
I think Port of San Diego budget humor is really hitting the mark here with your listeners. So I'm sorry that I started it, and I'm even more sorry that Councilman Cate continued it. So my apologies.
So then another good question that was asked was how much consideration is being given to modify the People's Ordinance, which again is that 1919 measure that made trash collection free for single family homeowners. This questioner asked, says it's really not an insignificant cost to the city and really isn't equitable to renters and condo owners.
Lisa, let's do it. Let's go. Yeah.
So what's your next step, Sean?
Well, I think in Environment Committee we want to talk about this later this year, and I'm serious. Like, it needs to go. So, we're going to try to make that happen.
Fellow Environment Committee member Chris Cate, what say you?
He's the chair. He gets to determine the agenda for the Environment Committee.
Will you be supportive?
Probably not.
That will be an interesting story to watch as the year continues. Please keep Voice of San Diego updated on those efforts. Sean, we have been writing about that issue for many, many years, not quite since 1919, but certainly have found stories going back to the mid-2000s on that topic when we were founded. One other question that's come up is, what is the attrition rate for City of San Diego safety and general members, and how does that compare with others in the area? This seems like a question for Mike.
So, one of the reasons San Diego sworn police officers got a significant raise in 2018 and 19 and 20 is because they were hemorrhaging officers to other jurisdictions paying more money. And so the city, paid attention to that and sort of righted that market. The problem is that is now true probably even more dramatically than it was for sworn police officers for literally hundreds of other job classifications. Our engineering job classifications at the city, there's not much turnover because we literally can't hire anybody. Our fire dispatchers, we've lost 40 trained fire dispatchers just in the last 5 years. The turnover rates measured by the San Diego Civil Service Commission and the vacancy rates measured by the city are both out of sight in proportion not only to other jurisdictions in San Diego, but as I said, even compared to, say, the sworn police officer crisis. And I think that was, and the reason I referenced that is because I think the public, sort of got that and understood it, and it was talked about a lot. It's a little harder to have a megaphone about the city's inability to hire a land surveyor. Maybe people don't care about that as much, but if they like infrastructure, if they like everything from a curb cut or a bridge being built, you need land surveyors, you need engineers, you need project managers, you need all of these positions that maybe aren't as headline grabbing as a sworn police officer, but that is what is going on primarily in job classifications represented by the Municipal Employees Association and AFSCME Local 127. And that's the crisis we're in right now, which is we're addressing at the bargaining table.
Well, it's been a great conversation tonight. So many more questions and topics that I wish we could have covered tonight. But please join me all, everyone on this YouTube tonight. Please join me in thanking our panelists for chatting with us about these really meaty budget topics. If you joined us, you're no doubt interested in the budget process. The City Council budget hearings are set to start on May 5th, and the mayor will release a revised budget proposal by mid-month. And then City Council members like Chris and Sean will weigh in again before they vote on the budget in June. So the budget season has just begun. There's lots of time and space to weigh in. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you who tuned in for being Voice of San Diego members and for caring about wonky budget topics. You make our work and events like this possible. If you like what you saw or you want to help us keep on keeping on, we are a nonprofit news organization. Please consider donating to Voice of San Diego. Thanks again and have a great evening.